Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Why don't you hang on for a few minutes? We're just waiting for everybody to come in and then we'll start the program. Just a minute or two before waiting for a few more people to get in and then we'll get going.
All right, and Glenn, I think you're ready to go.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. My name is Glenn Engelman. I'm president of the DuPont Circle Citizens Association and want to welcome you to the 5th installment of DCCA's educational series on homelessness. The title of our session tonight is What Will It Take to Change Direction? If you've tuned into our prior 4 sessions, among other things, you've had a lot of numbers thrown at you, whether it's statistics, whether it's dollar amounts. And for those of us that are not expert in this area, it's often hard to make sense as to, are we spending enough? Have we made enough progress? How should we track progress? And that's going to be the focus of our session tonight. We have a great panel of experts, and I'll let them introduce themselves one by one, and then we'll kick off the program. Eileen, do you want to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Eileen Rosa. I am the Deputy Chief of Policy and Programs with the Community Partnership for the Prevention of Homelessness, or TCP. Can let Tom introduce himself.
And I'm Tom Frederickson. I'm the Chief of Policy and Programs, also with the Community Partnership.
Okay, Jesse?
Hi, y'all. My name is Jesse Rabinowitz. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Advocacy and Campaign Manager at Miriam's Kitchen, where we work in chronic homelessness. We're based not far from DuPont, Dunn, and Foggy Bottom, and I manage our advocacy work pushing the mayor and the city council to do what is needed to end long-term homelessness.
Thanks. And last but not least, Steve?
I'm Steve Glade. I'm with the Coalition for Nonprofit Housing and Economic Development. We work on both housing and economic development policy and advocacy here in the district.
Okay, great. So tonight we're going to be covering homelessness and housing. We'll sort of start off with the homelessness part. So Tom and Eileen, over to you to get us going.
Okay. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Again, once again, my name is Tom Frederickson, and I'm with the Community Partnership for the Prevention of Homelessness, and I'm joined by my colleague Eileen this evening. We're going to talk some tonight, a little bit about our organization, give you some background about what it is that we do here in the district. We'll talk some about the numbers in terms of what we're seeing recently and over the last few years, in terms of the size of the population experiencing homelessness here in DC. And then we'll talk a little bit about some interventions that we're working on, as well as best practices as a way to sort of blend into the larger conversation about housing. To move on to sort of us as an agency, so the Community Partnership, or TCP, we were founded in 1989 as in response to a call for there to be a sort of a centralized agency focused on addressing the issue of homelessness and working as a go-between between the funding agencies as well as the actual service providers. So we at the Community Partnership, historically, the majority of our work has not been with direct services. We're more involved with the ancillary type services, program monitoring, maintenance and repair, data and reporting, which is what Eileen and I work on most regularly. And we have sort of formalized that role with agreements with both the federal government through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, as well as the local government through an agreement with DHS, or Department of Human Services. One of the terms that we'll use probably pretty regularly throughout tonight, so just to kind of make sure that folks are clear on it, is the term continuum of care, or COC. That has 3 sort of distinct meanings, and we just want to give sort of the context for what we're referring to in any kind of given mention of that term. So first and foremost, it's the system of care. So it's the slate of programs that folks presenting for homeless services are able to avail themselves of. And then that's also a strategic planning body. So there is a group of stakeholders in the district. That group is the District of Columbia Interagency Council on Homelessness. You've probably had representation from that office here at your meetings in the past. Basically, that is a group of folks from the mayor's cabinet, funding agencies, state providers, folks with lived experience of homelessness, working together to make sure that that system of care is as effective as possible. It also, that term continuum of care also gets used. It's just the name of the federal funding stream that we receive from HUD. So we'll just try to be clear as we go through kind of which definition we're working from in any mention of that. So I will, with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Eileen for a minute to talk about a little bit more about the system of care.
Sure. So as Tom mentioned, the system of care is made up of several different program models, all listed here on the left-hand side. So from prevention or early intervention for folks who are at risk of experiencing homelessness to those at the point of experiencing literal homelessness on the streets or in shelter, and then of course long-term housing programs. So when we talk about prevention or outreach, that's often the front door to our system, and we'll talk more about coordinated entry or what it means to have a coordinated response to homelessness, which looks different for the different populations that are listed here. So unaccompanied adults, meeting single individuals accessing shelter and services by themselves, families with children or other dependent family members, unaccompanied youth. So typically single adults in the 18 to 24-year-old range are considered unaccompanied adults, unaccompanied youth as opposed to minors or unaccompanied adults. Also definitely have programming for survivors of domestic violence who, of course, operate programs a little bit differently. Chronically homeless, as Jesse mentioned, which is the focus of their work, but chronic homelessness meaning just individuals or families that have long and repeated histories of homelessness, coupled with a disabling condition such that it is, impacting their ability to maintain housing on a stable basis. Veterans, and of course, clients identifying as LGBTQ+. So I think one thing just to highlight here before I pass it back over to Tom is that certain populations here often have more of one type of program model. So for families, we often, our biggest housing intervention for families with children is rapid rehousing. So that's the intention to quickly rehouse families from shelter into their own unit with rental subsidy over time. And of course, for youth, the approach is a little bit different, but just highlighting here the variance of program models for the different populations that we see in the community.
Thanks for that. So HMIS, that was referenced a couple of slides back in terms of one of the things that we're the lead on. So HMIS is the Homeless Management Information System, which is the primary repository for person-level information on the folks receiving services from the Continuum of Care program. So every agency, whether it's outreach, shelter, transitional housing, even some of the housing programs, if they're publicly funded either through DHS, HUD, the VA, et cetera, they are required to use HMIS to document information on the folks that they're serving at any given time. So HMIS, basically they're putting in rosters of the folks that they're serving. And so we can use HMIS at TCP to provide information on sort of the size and the scope of the population at any given time. We've had this in the district since about 2001. We're one of the longest standing implementations of HMIS in the country. And so we have information that dates back that far that we could produce information on for how homelessness has changed in the district over that time. The providers that are using HMIS, they also record demographic information, service need information, information on where folks are going when they're leaving their care. And that in turn, we can use to sort of better understand the programming that we need to develop to meet the emerging system needs, and then also kind of determine what system performance looks like, both at the continuum of care level and then for the individual providers. We often get asked about HMIS, how wide is the reach of this in terms of the coverage of beds within the district? And most of the programs operating in the district do receive some kind of public funding. So I would say kind of bed for bed, we're operating at about 90 to 95% of them are represented in our HMIS. So we have a pretty wide ranging coverage. As I mentioned, we've been at this since 2001 with sort of the traditional uses of HMIS. But a few years ago, we were able to sort of add on to what we were doing with that through our coordinated access system. And I'll turn it back over to Eileen to discuss that with everyone.
Thanks, Tom. So the Coordinated Assessment and Housing Placement, or CAP system, is really a process system, not necessarily a physical system or physical place, but it's really the process that we have implemented to be that crisis response system for folks who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of experiencing homelessness. And the purpose there is to have a common assessment tool or common entry points that really indicate that no matter who shows up to receive services has the same coordinated response, no matter who they engage with. And so that does look a little bit different based on family services versus single services in the district. So families do have a single point of entry through the Virginia Williams Family Resource Center as an example, whereas single individuals have access to a much more low barrier shelter and outreach system. So all of those sort of entry points, if you will, are intended to use the same assessment tool to really understand what clients' highest needs are, but also to help us understand, based on client needs through that assessment process, what housing resources will they need down the line and to ultimately end their homelessness. And of course, the goal again is to have that great understanding from the very beginning so that individuals do not need to experience a long episode of homelessness. So CAP, or as Tom said, Coordinated Entry System, we use these interchangeably. CAP is just the local term that we have used, but Coordinated Entry Systems as an idea are actually a federal requirement for all communities to have. So we need to have a coordinated response to homelessness, which involves the four elements that you see here. So access, meaning what are those entry points into the system? What are the processes for identifying people? Do certain subpopulations have the same level of access, and is it equitable? The next is assessment. So I mentioned a common assessment tool. So making sure that all providers are using the same assessment tool to make informed decisions and to make sure that we are not sort of operating by a first come, first served, whoever kind of gets on the right list at the right time. It really is based off of need and the highest, most medically vulnerable. And then from there, of course, segues us right into prioritization. So learning what we gather through the assessment process, using that assessment as well as other factors to understand who we need to prioritize for housing and why. And the reality there is because we do not have enough housing resources at a given time to always be matching every single person to a permanent resource or a permanent voucher. We have to be able to prioritize who gets served with the literal next resource and why. And so the other factors that go into that are, of course, again, chronic homelessness, length of homelessness, but also medical concerns, different vulnerabilities or risks that people are experiencing. The last piece of the CAP process is just that referral. So once a housing resource is identified and individuals or families are prioritized for that resource, that match is made and a warm handoff is made to connect them with the actual housing search and service process. So from there, they are connected with a permanent housing provider or a provider that is equipped to serve them so that they can be self-sufficient beyond a housing resource. Next slide, Tom. So to take us in before Tom kind of dives into more of the specific data and numbers that we have in the district, I think it's helpful context to cover what are some regular data and reporting projects, as well as some special projects that we have taken on as a community in respect to understanding our progress. So the point in time count, some of you may have been, may be familiar with this. It is an annual count that happens in the district, but also in all continuums of care across the nation on an annual basis. So it's just a point in time, a one single night count to understand homelessness and track year to year. But Tom will be going more into that in the next few minutes. Similarly, we have the homeless youth census, which is again focused on unaccompanied youth in that 18 to 24-year-old range. So really trying to understand how youth experience of homelessness may be different than that of single adults or families in the district. We also have some federal reports. So the Longitudinal System Analysis, or LSA, is that annual report to Congress. Again, you may have seen that in the news as kind of the big headline or the big trends across the nation. That is also informed by our system performance monitoring and quality improvement. So the process by which the district analyzes, provider performance, but also, again, trends over time to inform local performance. The next few bullet points there really speak to more special projects based off of different funding opportunities that the district has been awarded. So in 2019, I believe, we officially were awarded the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program, and that really was to develop a community plan in response to youth homelessness. And then the second part of that funding opportunity was also to develop actual new housing and new program investments to end youth homelessness through those programs. Similarly, Away Home America Grand Challenge is just another initiative to make sure that we are really dialing into understanding and creating a specific effort to end homelessness specifically for youth of color and youth who identify as LGBTQ through the Grand Challenge. So getting very specific assistance in developing that plan and continuing that work. The Domestic Violence Strategic Housing Plan, again, responding to specific needs of the housing programs to respond for DV survivors, but also making sure that that coordination across the homeless COC as well as the domestic violence provider network is growing and is utilizing resources in an efficient way. The CAP team, my team specifically, has been taking a closer look at racial equity, specifically within the assessment tool that I reviewed. So that common assessment that is used to engage and understand as an information gathering, but also as a prioritization tool, if that is being administered in an equitable way, but also that any decisions that we are using those tools for are implemented in an equitable fashion. And then finally, Kaiser Permanente veterans funding and regional coordination. So we've received some recent investments from partners like Kaiser Permanente, who are extremely interested and supportive of large communities to end veteran homelessness. And part of that funding will go to prevention money for veterans who may be at risk of experiencing homelessness. And then again, finally, the regional coordination. So understanding that, especially within the district, we have a unique sort of relationship with surrounding counties and jurisdictions. So what can we be doing better together to make sure that our response to homelessness is coordinated? I feel like that was a little long-winded, Tom, so I'm going to try and keep the next one short. Okay. So again, before we jump into some of the specific numbers, just understanding what we mean by movement through the system. And so I think this is a really helpful graphic to kind of understand the different pieces of the data and flow through the system that we're really understanding. So the first part is inflow. So the people coming into homelessness or experiencing homelessness, and that's made up of 3 different types. So clients or individuals or families who are newly identified as experiencing homelessness. This is the first time that they have had to engage in services or received housing assistance. Clients who might be re-experiencing homelessness, so maybe they came through shelter or services and were housed, but then returned for some time after that housing was unsuccessful for whatever reason. And then finally, return from inactive. So meaning that maybe they've come in for services and then they've made some other type of situation work and then they come back in for services and we're not quite sure exactly where they've been, but do know that they sort of cycle through our service system and wanting to make sure that we find a more permanent solution for them. So that's where we kind of have the standard clients who are actively homeless at a given time. So who is our standard population that we can understand and really start to engage to connect them to a long-term resource? And then of course, outflow. So who are the people that we are able to connect to permanent housing and are able to move in to their own units, and where we no longer consider them to fit the definition of homelessness within the context of our housing programs.
So just a few quick minutes here on the numbers that we're seeing recently and over the last few years. So the first bullet I've got here, this has probably been true for at least the last few months, where we're currently seeing on a given day about 300 families with children and about 4,000 unaccompanied individuals that are experiencing homelessness. I don't want to suggest that is exclusively street homelessness. We have a very robust network of shelters and transitional housing programs. Helene was mentioning on the previous slide. And about 90 to 95% of these numbers are folks that are in those programs. The remaining folks, usually singles, not a lot of families outside, are the folks that are unsheltered, so experiencing homelessness while not entering shelter or transitional housing programs. On the next bullet, so you can compare those numbers on kind of a given day snapshot numbers to what we would be serving over the course of the federal fiscal year. So 2020, the last one we completed, we served just under 1,400 families over the course of those 12 months, and then just over 9,200 unaccompanied individuals. Both of those numbers are down quite a bit since the beginning of the public health emergency a year ago. We know through the eviction moratorium and just kind of folks being able to sort of stay within their social networks outside of the shelter system, inflow has been way down in the last year. I think that raises the obvious concern that once the moratoriums are lifted and the emergency has expired, that we're going to see a lot of inflow into the system. And so just wanted to kind of touch a little bit on the fact that from both the local and federal government, there are quite a few initiatives to sort of help with prevention assistance, to address rental or mortgage arrearages, utility arrearages, relocation assistance, et cetera, to help sort of keep that inflow number at bay as much as possible when again, the moratorium is lifted and the emergency expires. Also, Eileen's team has been working to sort of make that outflow happen the entire time. So our numbers are as low as they are because both inflow has slowed down, but we are continuing to move folks out of the system and into housing at basically the same rate we were prior to the public health emergency. And then sort of, I will skip over this one and just sort of show you rather than read through the slide. These are the numbers that on the blue line here, this is the total number of families that we've served over the last few fiscal years, culminating in that 1371 we looked at a couple slides back. As you can see, our family number has gone down pretty significantly since 2016, really dramatically in that first year. And that's really been driven by the decrease here in this orange number, which is a subset of the blue number. This is the number of folks that were experiencing homelessness for the first time in these fiscal years. And so as we've developed prevention resources to keep folks from having to enter the system, that's really helped to drive down our numbers, in addition to the additional housing resources and just creating more efficient programming to sort of move people through the system a little faster than we had previously. We're starting to see sort of a similar trend on the single side, although because resources are limited, we weren't able to invest as much in singles at the same level as we were doing in families back in FY15 and 16. So we were seeing for a while sort of flat to increasing numbers for singles, but we've gone down pretty steadily since 18, although I think we're going to have to, at least for the time being, treat the FY20 numbers with a little bit of grain of salt until we're further into 21 and 22 to know sort of what's going to happen with that inflow question after the public health emergency. So I'll turn it back to Eileen to talk a little bit about those housing interventions we're connecting people with.
So there are three main housing program models. The biggest of which is permanent supportive housing. So that's PSH at the bottom of this list here, which I'll get back to in a moment. But I think all three of these program models have a space within our continuum of care and serve, again, might be more likely to have more depending on the subpopulation. So transitional housing is a time limited, it's a program-based housing model with a more specific focus on case management, building income, and that connection to services. The goal is that after that period of time that the client, is able to move out on their own and independently, but it is possible that they may need further assistance if they have other medical needs or other concerns that require more long-term services. Rapid rehousing is another time-limited resource, but it is intended, again, to promote housing first and to really lease people back up with a sense of independence into their own units. It is a time-limited rental subsidy with housing search assistance and case management. So again, the goal there is that over time that the client assume and eventually take over the full payment of the lease, but is really just, again, promoting sort of rapid exit from shelter and really quick lease up to minimize the experience of homelessness in a particular shelter or street. And then again, finally, the permanent supportive housing. So this is long-term permanent, as it says, either through leasing dollars or through vouchers with our local housing authority, coupled with case management. And it typically happens in two different types, scattered site, which is sort of a tenant-based voucher that goes with the client, and the housing search is in the standard rental market within the district, or project-based, where there are certain buildings that may have a set of PSH units, or where the whole building are dedicated units for our population, and the voucher is tied to that unit, where, again, clients prioritized for housing would be matched there, and at times there are services available on site. So those are our three main sort of program interventions. As you can see here, based on the assessment numbers, of over half, roughly over half of those assessed are recommended for some long-term or permanent housing solution. And I think that just really reflects some of the medical needs and age of our population, particularly single adults in the district. So you might find that response is a little bit different for single adults versus families. And just to highlight some of those successful approaches, I think by subpopulation, for single adults, we have seen that prevention and diversion services are expanding. And I think, as Tom just said, as we get further into FY21 and kind of come out of COVID response, that we'll start to see what that inflow into homelessness would look like when the eviction moratorium is lifted and things of that nature. But really, again, a prioritization of shelter long stayers and clients who are chronically homeless within the district has shown a lot of that movement and decrease in homelessness over time. For families, again, I mentioned that rapid rehousing, also known as FRSP for families, has really been the biggest intervention, and coupled with prevention on the front end to reduce that inflow that I mentioned earlier, has shown that decrease over time. For veterans, the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs has a large investment in permanent housing for veterans, and we have seen that continue to grow and be the main resource that we have to reducing veteran homelessness over time. And then finally, youth. I think the big takeaway here is that options are key. So we haven't found a perfect housing model that works for all youth, but I think the important thing is to have options. So based on their identity, on their safety, on their priorities, what is sort of the right fit. Sometimes that is a transitional housing model where it's more like a group home. Sometimes that's let's lease you up into your own unit and start to assist with that rental history and building credit and all of those good things within that developmental stage. So again, just kind of underlining for all of these subpopulations that, using our data to inform decisions in terms of the success of programs, barriers that we see with certain programs, and just monitoring that performance across program types.
And then just a final word on how we measure success. So we look at things like utilization rates of the programs, the length of time people are in those programs, the rates at which they exit to permanent housing destinations. We look at these things kind of individually to make sure that we're seeing well-performing programs and a well-performing system. But I think it's really important that we kind of look at them all collectively together to sort of really understand them as a check and balance on one another at the true efficacy of the system. Any one of them, like success in any one could actually be driven by sort of a lack of success on another. So we, again, really just want to make sure that we're looking at the whole picture when we're assessing success. So I'll wrap up with that, and we look forward to your questions. So thank you.
Thanks, Tom and Eileen. Jesse, over to you for your perspective.
Hi all, thanks so much. And again, my name is Jesse and I work over at Miriam's Kitchen. Before we dive in, I did want to just take a second to acknowledge the 8 people that were murdered by white supremacists in Atlanta, including 6 women murdered by an act of, patriarchal rooted white supremacy. So their families and the whole AAPI community are certainly in my heart and my thoughts tonight. And it's also a reminder that those same systems that resulted in those 8 people getting murdered are the same systems that lead over 85% of individuals experiencing homelessness in DC to be Black. We know that homelessness is caused by oppressive systems, including racism and capitalism, and see all of these as an interconnected fight to ensure that everyone is able to live and thrive in housing that they need and want. So I hope most folks are familiar with Miriam's, but I'll do a quick little background. We've been operating in Foggy Bottom for about 37 years. We're still going during COVID. We provide about 300 meals a day, breakfast and dinner. We provide permanent supportive housing, which is one of the interventions that Eileen and Tom talked about for about 240 individuals scattered throughout the district. We also have a homeless street outreach team that does homeless street outreach in DuPont, most of Ward 2, most of Ward 1, most of Ward 3, parts of Ward 4. We cover about 33 square miles of the city. And then we also have our advocacy team where I work trying to push the mayor and the DC Council to invest in homelessness. And I'll say that I've worked on our outreach team, I've worked in our dining room. So I've worked in all different parts of the system, and I'm excited to talk about how the data can be used to drive change. I think Tom and Eileen did a really great job laying out the really robust mechanisms of data collection we have in the city. So I hope their presentations really made it clear that like this is not a data issue, right? Like we can tell you from last year's point in time count that like, where did it go? 6,380 individuals or households were experiencing homelessness. I can tell you that about 430 families are experiencing chronic homelessness. I can tell you that 2,671 individuals need permanent supportive housing right now to get out of homelessness. This is not a data issue. What it is an issue of is political will. And I just did want to briefly mention today, the HUD released a kind of top sheet preview of the most recent point in time count. And I think to nobody's surprise, homelessness went up. We don't know what that'll look like in DC, but I imagine that after we factor in the results of the pandemic, we're not going to be in a good way. There's national data showing that homelessness caused by COVID may increase by 40 to 45%. So in a system that is already overstretched and under-resourced, adding 3,000 to 3,500 people to our homeless services system is just, it's not good. So what I'm excited to talk about is to stress on some of those solutions that Eileen and Tom mentioned. And this isn't like rocket science, right? We know that housing with supportive services ends homelessness. In Miriam's Kitchen has ended homelessness, chronic homelessness for over 220 people. And when we look back at our 1-year success rate, 95 to 97% of our clients remain stably housed after the first year, showing that like when people get into housing, they stay in housing. And that success is mirrored throughout many of our partner agencies across the city, and DC has phenomenal success rates for people who get into permanent housing. But due to years of underinvestment, both from the city and the federal government, there are only housing resources for 1 out of 10 individuals experiencing homelessness. So 90% of people who are living outside or in shelters without additional money are going to be there next year, which is why we at Miriam support and organize the Way Home campaign, which brings together about 107 organizations, including DuPont Circle Citizens Association, and about 6,000 supporters who really believe that like DC needs to be putting money up for this solution. So this year we're calling on the mayor to invest $100 million to end long-term homelessness for about 2,600 individuals and about 430 families. And I just want to underscore that, especially for individuals, these are the people who are living in tents on the street. These are the people who are living outside. These are the people who are living in shelters. And without investment from the mayor and the council, they're going to be there next year. I'm a social worker. I don't want to see anybody living without housing. I think it's a moral abomination in the capital of this country, in a city with a budget of $16 billion, that there are people living and dying outside. But we know that it's not a personal failing, right? This is a result of centuries and decades of oppressive systems that have made housing too expensive, that have made people not be able to afford to live here. And we believe that through those same systems that cause homelessness and our housing crisis, which are targeted policies and budgets, are the same tools that we need to use to end our homelessness and housing crisis. And it's going to take money. So what we're doing is calling on the mayor to put up some money and really put her money where her mouth is. She ran on a campaign of ending chronic homelessness by 2017. It's 2021, and we're not there. So we're calling on the mayor, and I'll put some action alerts in the link and in the chat and ways to stay involved. But we're really calling on her to show the country that DC cares about ending homelessness, and that rhetoric of caring is matched up with the funding needed to do so. So we hope, y'all have a new council member who so far has been really supportive of this issue. And we need to make sure that council member Pinto continues to hear from all of you. I used to live in DuPont, but got priced out, so she can't hear from me anymore. But to hear from all of you that the solution to all of this is really not complicated. The solution is housing and supportive services, and DC and the country have shown time and time again that when we put money into these things, it works. We often hear like, why are we still seeing people outside? We're seeing people outside because there's only funding for 10% of the people to get vouchers. So a lot of people take that to mean that like, we don't know what we're doing and permanent supportive housing doesn't work. But if you only fund 10% of something and are expecting to get 100% of the results, it's just not going to work. We're already doing all that we can with crumbs. Meanwhile, we see organizations and, tax breaks for wealthy and all sorts of different things. I think one example is how the city was able to find so much money to bail out businesses during COVID, which is great. Small and local businesses need support, 100%. But whenever we ask for support for people living outside and in shelter, we're always told, sorry, there's just not enough money. And we fundamentally disagree. And we believe that budgets are moral documents, or should be moral documents. And to us, a moral budget is one that reflects people's basic needs like housing and healthcare and access to food before funding things like the streetcar. So I will get off my soapbox, and I look forward to answering questions, and I'll put some info in the chat. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Jesse. Steve, over to you to talk about these issues from a perspective of affordable housing.
Yeah, Jesse, I'm glad you mentioned the $100 million number so that we know. We probably would have been calling you in a week or so to find out what the number is going to be for this year's advocacy. I do come from a kind of another side of the aisle, the affordable housing side of the aisle. One comment before I talk about CNHED, and it kind of puts some context to what Ellen and Tom have said, but particularly what Jesse said. Part of our assessment of why we are here in this moment, and Jesse's absolutely right, it is an issue of political will. But I will say, from the learning lens that I've had in being in the city government previously and then coming into this work at CNHED, is that we probably as a community begin to focus on this about 8 years too late. And what I mean by that is we're all aware of the growth that occurred in the district when we went in pursuit of 100,000 new residents in a 10-year period. We actually brought in 115,000. And there really wasn't awareness about the affordable housing crisis in that time. And I don't want to say that awareness alone would have gotten us to better places earlier than we're now pursuing, because the political will is still absolutely essential to be matched with that awareness. But and so as I listen to Jesse and the data rollout, I'm always reminded of the context that we got going late in focusing on this as a city, in looking at the threats and the challenges that we face. The coalition is made up of about 100 nonprofits around the city who work in affordable housing, human services, economic development, small business development, workforce development, and more. And what we focus on is policy, advocacy, and research. And I kind of just want to talk a little bit about what we do. We're largely led, although we have some umbilical cords to resident leaders and tenants, we're really largely guided by service providers, by affordable housing developers. Most our members produce all of the 0 to 30 AMI housing in the city, and we produce higher AMI level housing as well. And we're also made up by some of the large for-profit developers. We're also comprised of about 60 what we call mission-driven for-profits. They're for-profits who embrace a community mission, who also provide affordable housing and deep subsidy housing. And part of what we do, in addition to the obvious budget and advocacy work, is we also look at policies, legislation, and programs. So the way we kind of, our anatomy of how we work is we have working groups that address issues like homeownership and permanent supportive housing, intended opportunity to purchase, and some others. And through those working groups, we pay attention to how programs are working, what regulatory changes need to be made to those programs, what improvements. We weigh in on every piece of legislation related to the service areas that we pay attention to. So we're in rent control, we're in the TOPA laws, we're in the comp plan, we're in anything that might impact the field and the industry and the service providers. We're involved in that. So our heavy lift is in the policy area and the advocacy. One historical context, about 12 years ago, we launched the Housing for All campaign. It was the Housing for All campaign in concert with others that really awakened the city to the affordable housing crisis that it was facing. Before that campaign, it was before my time, before that campaign really got legs, there weren't a lot of newspaper articles about the affordable housing challenges in DC. There were very few council hearings and certainly not much legislation around affordable housing and or homelessness issues. Frankly, I can say nobody ran for office with homelessness or affordable housing as a primary campaign platform. And of course, we've seen now in recent years a really dramatic shift in that. The mayor did run both her initial campaign and her reelection with affordable housing and homelessness prevention as, or addressing homelessness as her primary, campaign platform. And it is an issue of really sustaining political will. So our campaign set out to do three things: raise public awareness, build the political will to publicly invest, and get the Housing Production Trust Fund to at least $100 million annually, which we've achieved, but it's still nowhere near enough. In preparation, I was trying to find the number that the Urban Institute produced a couple of years ago about how many units, affordable housing units we were short here in the district. And I didn't find the district number, but because the study was done on the region, but that study a couple of years ago said that we were 264,000 units short for what the region needed. And if I had more time to dig, I would have probably dug into what it was saying for the district. And so I think that for us, our approach is that we have to really keep the focus on political will. The district does a good job in national comparisons to what other cities do. I mean, if you just count the numbers, we have the largest trust fund per capita in the United States. Only New York has more money in their fund. They have a gazillion more people to take care of us. And if you look regionally, I mean, I just have to say it, we dwarf our neighboring counties in terms of affordable housing investments, and not just in the trust fund, but other programs as well. But it is nowhere near the need. And I think the other thing that's important to note is that it's not just a matter of money. I mean, money is important. I will say this, nothing replaces cash or capital when you're trying to address these problems, but we also need compliance. I mean, if you look at the 900 million that we put in the trust fund the last 9 years, and I think that number is close to accurate, if we had been in compliance with the trust fund mandates of having most of the money go to 0 to 30 AMI housing, we'd be further down the road in addressing the problem. And so it is a matter of money, but it's also a matter of compliance. If you look at some of the other regulations and laws that we have that have a lot of loopholes, that have a lot of exemptions and other things, if we take a comprehensive approach to not only ensuring investment, but assuring adherence and compliance, we would have a stronger platform to address not only homelessness, but affordable housing as well. A couple of other things that we do real quickly. One of our big focuses is on preservation. You know, it was determined a long time ago that it made no sense to focus on the production of new units if we were losing units because of expiring covenants. So we, in partnership with the Urban Institute, manage what is known as the preservation database. We also manage the preservation network, which is made up of every relevant public agency, plus legal services and tenant advocates and others, to look at every publicly subsidized unit in the city on a monthly basis. Short math, about 40 years ago, a lot of developers across the country, but here in DC as well, into 40-year federal covenants in order to maintain a percentage of their units as affordable. Those covenants began to expire, feels like maybe 5 years ago, we began to see the opening up of those covenants, and it may be longer. And so in order to protect those units, we track the building owner's intent. If their intent is to renew the covenant, we facilitate the renewal of that covenant through that preservation network. If there is intent to sell, we engage and work with the tenants, because in DC, if a building under a federal covenant is going to sell, they have to sell to the tenants first. So we make sure a couple things happen. We make sure that the tenants are organized. We make sure that they have good legal representation. We make sure that the property is assessed at fair market value, so that in the selling and the transference of the property, the tenants are not gouged by overpricing, and a host of other things of that nature. And then one more operationally thing that we do is we operate a landlord partnership fund. There are a lot of families that if we're going to really tackle the homeless number, we have to ensure that families coming through the rapid rehousing program get access to rental leases when they're prepared to rent. And we know that there are two major barriers that keep some families coming through the system from getting access to leases, and that's eviction history and credit score. And so we operate a fund where we encourage landlords to take greater risk than they typically would to lease up these families. And if the family does damage to the unit or skips out on the rent, they can apply to us for financial relief. And the program has been, I mean, it's not reaching nearly enough, but it has been, it's been heavily used, and it is also very effective. And that's one of the operational things that we do. And so just to cap off, I think, and one last thing I talked about, it's more than money. Part of the political will that we have to build is not just with our politicians, it's with our public. And so we're looking at the challenges of dispersing affordable housing throughout the city. We're looking at provisions in the comp plan that are going to see that affordable housing is more evenly distributed. And I do think that the district has goodwill on that. I do think that it is met with a lot of public resistance. So one of the things that all of us can contribute to is strengthening that public will to be a part of the solution as well. So there's got to be political will to continue to publicly invest, but that needs to be matched or at least teamed with public will so that communities more broadly see themselves as part of the solution as well. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions that people may have.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Thanks, everybody. Great presentation. we have a few questions in the chat, and I may have one or two. First one, which sort of ties, I think, all four presentations together. The community partnership charts show some good progress on with respect to families. It seems to indicate good progress with respect to singles, despite the pandemic, although based on my own visual observations, I'm a little skeptical, to be honest. But you know, that said, Jesse highlighted a very significant challenge in terms of funding. As Steve's pointed out, maybe some of the problem is sort of compliance, but is it a compliance issue? If it isn't, what is the first thing you all would like to see in terms of changing priorities from the city to make a real dent, particularly in the single homelessness issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would agree that I don't think the trend lines for single homelessness look that great, especially given the impacts of COVID. I think, as Steve said, the first thing we need is money. Like, money is what money, like, I can't say it more simply than that. Some other things that we need to do are like massive eviction prevention, especially due to the COVID pandemic, like large scale rent relief. We're about to get a lot of money from the federal government. We're about to get like, what, $2.2 billion. So if we're ending homelessness, but people are still getting evicted, the net is probably a net negative. So we need to both get people off the streets and into housing and make sure that nobody else enters into homelessness at all. And I would say that like the biggest fundamental shift we need to have as a city is about how we use our budget, right? Is our budget used as a tool to gentrify neighborhoods and push Black and brown people out? Or is it a tool used to make sure that our region and our city's growing prosperity is shared among people who built the city, who literally built the city? And right now, the council continually votes to say, you know, we're okay to keep giving tax breaks to rich people and corporations and underfund social services systems. And what we're saying is, like, DC has enough money already. We just need to better prioritize how we're spending it. And to me, that means everyone has to pay their fair share. We know that wealthy people have gotten richer throughout the pandemic, while people living on lowest incomes have gotten poorer. And that's not what morality looks like. So in order for us to fundamentally get to this issue, we need to make sure that wealth and prosperity is equitably distributed throughout the country, throughout the city.
You know, there's one concern that that looms large, and I don't think it's just for us, but I think others, and that is what happens when the moratorium eviction ends because of the pandemic. I think that represents a level of uncertainty, and people, we're trying to wrap our heads and hands and policies around it, but frankly, we don't know. And I think we have to be prepared. I mean, I will say this, I think that the district did a lot right during the pandemic. I don't think it covered every base well. I'm on 3 national boards. I get a look into other cities and how they handled the pandemic and reopening and everything else. And I think, you know, I give our city leaders credit because they did, in my view, they put safety over commerce and they did follow science. But I also want to do this, and I don't say this patronizingly, Jesse. I think that one thing that's important is to have a standard that no homeless person is acceptable. And in that conversation, I mean, affordable housing is a different conversation. You know, there's their gains and their timelines and their progressions, but you have to have a high standard around the issue of homelessness. And one thing I give Way Home credit for is they don't like any of us off the hook, and including me and my leadership and my membership who are in a different space. And I think that that's important. And so I commend Way Home for constantly reminding us that it is a moral issue, that one homeless person is not acceptable, because getting through those numbers is a very challenging thing to do. It requires a lot of different coordinated interventions to get a individual or family to not just a place of housing, but to a place of wellness. But if you don't have the standard, you will never achieve. And so I think we have to keep reminding ourselves. And that's why I also say that the issue of not just political will, but public will is very important when it comes to that issue.
Thanks. Maybe if I can build on that, I'll turn this over to Tom and Eileen for an answer. One question from the audience has to do with a commitment some other cities seems to have made to bring homelessness to functional zero, quote unquote. It would seem like the HMIS system you mentioned would have the data that would allow us to adopt that kind of approach. Is there any talk within DC circles of making that a public commitment and leveraging the data that you all talked about to get us there?
Go ahead.
So actually the larger initiative there through Community Solutions called Built for Zero, DC is a participating community. Their approach though is mostly to start with communities ending veteran homelessness and reaching the functional zero threshold for veterans, and then moving on to other populations like chronically homeless families and then youth. We of course don't have the luxury of just focusing on one population at a time. So our homeless response system has to be very robust for every part of our population. But that is the initiative that we do participate in and have made large strides, particularly in
I think Eileen's frozen there. Tom, do you want to?
I think, yeah, what she was wrapping up with making definite strides. We were down about 30% with our veterans counts, and starting to make progress with the chronic singles as well.
And one thing I would just add is that, like, when we look at a bunch of the cities that have reached functional zero, they started with like maybe 30 people experiencing chronic homelessness, and we're starting with thousands. So the scale is different, which means the investments need to be different.
Steve, I'll hit you with two questions given the time. One, I'd like to get your reaction about the inclusionary zoning law. There was last couple of days, I think OP sort of trumpeting the fact that they've enhanced the requirements. And then any thought some other cities and countries have gone to more of a social housing model with government built housing? I'd like to get your reaction on both those issues.
On the government built housing, and this is a variation on it, we followed up the creation of the TOPA, tenant opportunity to purchase, with DOPA, which is the district opportunity to purchase, which is not the same thing as social housing, but it would preserve housing if a building covenant was expiring and the tenants decided not to buy that housing. Before that housing goes market rate, the district could step in and buy it and maintain the affordability. We have not talked about social housing in our circles. It hasn't emerged as a policy consideration for us. On inclusionary zoning, so I'm going to take off my CNHD hat for a moment and this is personal. So this is an example in some ways of what I mean by compliance. You know, the intent of inclusionary zoning was that if housing was going to be developed near amenities, that poor people would have the access to those amenities. And in enacting law where exemptions are given and loopholes are created, you can now build that housing. If I'm correct, you can build those required units up to a mile away. And there's some tweaks to the model where some of the units are home ownership versus rental, but I still envision a single woman with a baby in a stroller and another one in her hand walking a mile to a bus stop or to a grocery store or to a metro, which is how it sometimes plays out. And so I just think that the concept of inclusionary zoning, and I have to confess, I'm not up on the recent OP, my staff is, but I'm not up on the recent OP enhancement of that. I know that the district believes in it as a tool to foster more affordable housing units in the city. I don't want to comment further on the specific OP enhancement because I know it's a recent thing and I'm not up on it.
Okay, fair enough. Given the time, I'll ask two related questions about the point in time effort every year. One audience member asked, is that information available by ward? And if so, when? And then the second question is, Tom and Eileen, you know, the data set you've talked about seems pretty comprehensive, and you would think would pick up folks that are living on the street. Yet we do this on an annual basis. Could you explain why the point in time effort is necessary if you're so confident in the data you're collecting?
Yeah, well, one thing that is helpful is, so there's about 5 to 10% of the programs that operate in the district that don't participate in HMIS. So it gives us an opportunity to hear from them what they're seeing and to aggregate those numbers with what we have in HMIS to make sure that it's a 100% complete count. It also gives us an opportunity to kind of dig into kind of emerging issues that we might not have much information about from regular data collection. A year or two ago, we tacked on a question to the point in time survey about whether or not folks had like their vital documents with them, their IDs, their birth certificates, et cetera. And based on like kind of the low numbers we were seeing of people being in possession of those, we spearheaded some work with DHS and DOH to get people that were district residents or district natives rather, to be able to get connected with those documents and get them in hand. So that would help kind of facilitate, you know, their connection to housing and other resources that one needs those documents for. So it does always give us a good snapshot, but it always gives us a chance to get like kind of a better picture of what we've been looking at and kind of better understand emerging needs. The 2020 information that we collected in January, we're putting the finishing touches on now. That will be available early next month, and we will have a dashboard on our website that will break out the engagements by ward as well.
Okay, thanks. And Jesse, one last question to you. The $100 million ask, could you sort of break that down? Like what percentage of the DC overall budget is that really going to be, and sort of how many folks would that help?
Yeah, so the $100 million is less than 1/2 of 1% of DC's overall $16.9 billion budget. It's a pretty small percentage. I would just like to point out that MPD has a budget of $500 million a year, $570 million a year. So we can see what happens when things get funded, and we at Miriam's Kitchen fundamentally believe that communities and solidarity keep us safe and not the police. So I do want to say that we fully support taking money from the police department to invest in community needs like housing and safety. And I put a link to our blog in the chat, which breaks down how the $100 million is spent, but that goes to permanent supportive housing for about 2,600 individuals and about 430 families. It also really importantly adds, last year, the mayor cut money for homeless street outreach, which is the people you see going on people who go checking in on people who are living at, I don't know, 17th and Q Street and trying to get them connected towards housing. So we need a $1.8 million restoration so that outreach funding can continue. So that is also built into the $100 million figure.
Okay, great, thanks. Apologies to the audience members whose questions we didn't have time to get to. But I want to thank the panel for a great conversation. And I think it also demonstrates the interconnectivity of the various groups working in what is a complicated issue, and appreciate all you do in that work. And I also want to give a shout out to my co-lead for this presentation, Tim Norman, who helped, fellow board member who helped organize the event today. So with that, let me turn it over to the chair of our homelessness committee, Nick Manning. Nick, you want to turn on your video?
I hope I have. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Glenn. And just for those of you who haven't seen my face before, I'm Nick Manning. I've been coordinating the DuPont Circle Citizens Association Homelessness Committee for the last few months. And it's been great to listen into this event tonight and to learn from this, I mean, truly excellent panel. Thanks a million. So thanks, Tom, Stephen, Eileen, and Jesse. And also thank you, Glenn and Tim, who've worked hard to pull the discussion together. And thanks, Erica, who's behind the scenes and who's managed the techniques. This has been the penultimate in a 6-session series. And the idea of the Citizens Association putting on this series was to provide information and informed views so that as neighbours we're in a better position to make our own decisions about how best to help and how, very particularly how best to campaign for change, to bridge the blatant gap between political claims and the cruel reality that we see on the streets. I just want to provide just a very quick run through where this discussion series has been as we approach the end. The first session, we looked at the additional difficulties, the further trauma that COVID-19 has added to the lives of people experiencing homelessness. The second session, we looked at some of the roots of homelessness, just the cruel arithmetic of the need for affordable housing and its limited availability. The third session, we talked about psychological challenges and substance abuse, and we heard about the cruel conundrum there. There's a higher incidence of such needs amongst people experiencing homelessness, but homelessness in itself has severe psychological consequences. Last week, we heard about the importance of permanent supportive housing in moving people from sidewalks to safe homes. And tonight, we've heard about policy in DC. And to me, tonight has underscored that DC is in a deep hole when it comes to availability of affordable housing and supportive services for single people. It's achieved a lot in addressing family homelessness, but we've heard that the situation for single unhoused people remains tragically awful. And let's be clear, it's a shameful failure in civic governance and an obvious tragedy. And when we talk about policy, then I think it's important that we all keep in mind that policy isn't what you claim. It isn't what you say you're going to do. It's what you actually do. And DC has done well in several areas, but in addressing homelessness for single people, there continues to be much, much more political rhetoric than policy reality. Next week, we'll conclude the series by hearing the experiences of LGBTQ youth and of women who've experienced homelessness, looking at the very particular challenges that they face. So just to emphasize, our purpose in this series is to help all of us in the neighborhood reach informed views about where we can and should go from here. So thanks again to you all, and see you all next week on March the 25th. Thanks very much.